At least 3 times a week. We would FaceTime, call, text frequently. She kept me updated on this whole trip. I believed the first couple of days when I wasn't getting responses, I believed she was in a place with no service. It was like day 8 and 9 that I really became concerned.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. In this episode, we're going to examine the question, why did Nicole, that's Gabby's mother, take so long to report her daughter missing? There are a few important things we still don't know regarding the relationship dynamics. We're getting a clearer picture of Gabby's apparently toxic relationship with Brian, but what was her relationship with her own family like, or his family? How did the Petitos get along with the Laundries? Did the Petitos approve of Brian as a future son-in-law? Did the Schmidts? A few hours ago, someone asked a question which I think cuts to the heart of this issue. Quote, I haven't found an answer to this anywhere, so I was hoping someone here would know. Why did Gabby's parents wait so long to report her missing? I'm not at all pointing blame at anyone. I just don't understand why, if they were in constant communication with her and then there was nothing. Why did they wait, I believe, until September 11th to report her missing? End quote. Thanks for that question, and in this episode, we'll explore the answer. I have to concur with the commenter here that by asking this question, we're not trying to blame anyone. We're trying to figure out what happened in the aftermath to August 27th. We're trying to connect the dots to how and why we got here in the first place. Does that make sense? So in the episode, we're simply going to address this question from a couple of angles, basically 5 different angles, and see if that brings us to a place where we know Gabby better and can figure out what Brian has been doing and what we'll do.
Worth playing for?
Yeah.
Before we get started with today's episode, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Like, share, leave a comment. Thank you to the many of you who have subscribed in the last few days. And let's get started. So the first section deals with the relationship between mother and daughter. And you heard in that clip right at the beginning from WPTV, Nicole Schmidt expressing how often that she was in contact with Gabby.
At least 3 times a week. We would FaceTime, call, text frequently. She kept me updated on this whole trip.
Now, one thing I noticed in the recent footage of Gabby's family giving a press conference was that Gabby's mother, Nicole, was by far the most emotional person present. She was struggling to control her emotions, especially towards the end. What I also think complicates the roles in a mixed family situation is who is ultimately responsible for an adult child, a young adult child. Gabby was just 22 years old. Is it the father, is it the stepmother, or is it the biological mother who lives far away? Bear in mind, Joe and Tara are both based in Vero Beach, Florida, fairly close to where Gabby and Brian stayed with his parents in Northport, Florida. They're just on opposite sides of the panhandle, while Nicole and Jim are based in Blue Point, Long Island, New York. So because of physical distance and multiple parents in a mixed family situation, as well as the status of engaged or unofficially engaged, who is ultimately responsible for Gabby if something happens to her? Is it Brian? Is it Brian's parents? Is it Gabby's father, or is it Gabby's mother? And what role, if any, should the step-parents play? Can you see it's quite complicated and quite confusing? Because Nicole is one of the most important witnesses in this case, she may have been advised not to say very much at this most recent press conference. The lawyer was there, but bear in mind, she didn't speak at the funeral either. I wouldn't read too much into this except to say that I think Gabby's murder has affected her the most. And I also think Gabby's a lot more like her mother than her father. Have a look at this comparative composite with Gabby opposite her mother Nicole, both of them wearing their hair in similar styles. And then here in the Sandy Hook video, Gabby's wearing similar black framed glasses as her mother. Gabby's a lot more like her mother than her father, quiet, reserved, cautious, although she seems to have inherited something from her dad, and that something is perhaps why she undertook the summer epic in the first place, something perhaps quite brash, quite brave. Her father, as I understand, is also a salesman of sorts. Joe recently updated his Twitter profile from something to do with, I'm not sure if it was installing cable or something like that, or a cable sales guy, but is now a sales manager at Home Depot. So think about that, sales and social media. Being a social media creator is, in a sense, about constantly pitching your truth. Is it fair to say that besides Brian, Gabby was closest to her biological mother, Nicole Schmidt? And so if things deteriorated with Brian, if there were problems, and they did, we know there were escalating tensions, who would be the first person Gabby would confide in? It wasn't Rose Davis. It wasn't Cassie, Brian's sister. It was her mother, Nicole. And so the question arises, did she confide in her mother? And if she did, how much? And what did she tell her mother? And what about money? Did Gabby, as many bright-eyed, bushy-tailed young people do, ask her folks for money? On September 14th, Nicole Schmidt broke her silence, telling the Daily Mail, quote, "And I supported her on all of that, even every once and a while when she needed help money-wise and stuff, because it was a really expensive trip. I helped her out a little bit here and there. So did her father. But they were having a great time," end quote. I think that is quite important to bear in mind, this statement that it was a really expensive trip. That alone can be a huge stressor on any person, especially someone who's quit their job. Would she have told her mother during the trip that she was fighting, that they were having arguments? Would she have told her mother they were or had broken up? Would she have told her mother much about Brian's abuse? On the 15th of September 2021, there was an article on Fox News. The article states, quote, "Petito's mom, Nicole Schmidt, said that the incident was just a result of pent-up stress from traveling together." And this is obviously a reference to the Moab incident. And so you almost kind of get a sense that she's a little bit dismissive of it, that, there was just a bit of stress and it wasn't really a really big deal. And I think that is also what the cops on scene misinterpreted, that they didn't think it was a big deal either. That brings us to the second point, intertextuality. In the Chris Watts case, the Patrick Frazee case, also the Barry Morphew case, Laurie Vallow, and even to some extent the Gannon Store case, one has a sense that all 5 perpetrators were counting on the physical distance between the victims and their closest family members to act as a sort of barrier, helping them commit, cover up, and potentially get away with their crimes. Then number 3, the perp's perspective. In the Petito case, we have to try to imagine things from the perp's perspective. At some point, people are going to ask questions, and so he's going to need a story handy. At some point, people are going to notice her missing. He's going to need to stretch out that process as long as possible. In other words, delay the moment of alarm, the moment of panic. And think about the Casey Anthony case as a successful effort in that regard. It took 31 days for people to realize 2-year-old Kaylee was missing. Remember that. Now, in terms of this whole idea of stretching out the process of getting someone to notice, Patrick Frazee did that quite successfully by also staging text with the victim's phone. And so it does appear that something like that happened here, doesn't it?
I believed the first couple of days when I wasn't getting responses, I believed she was in a place with no service. It was like day 8 and 9 that I really became concerned.
And so the perp's perspective and what he's doing to purposefully frustrate, obfuscate, mix up and muddy the actual events, that's an important part of the answer to why it took so long to report Gabby missing. Do you see that? Does that make sense? So now we go on to number 4, the timeline. So let's get practical now about what exactly was said and when at the most critical junctures in the timeline. So if we go to the timeline from the New York Times, on August 23rd and 24th, Mr. Schmidt, that's Jim, said that he and Ms. Petito's mother, Nicole Schmidt, actually spelled with an H. There's some variation in the spelling of her name, but I think it's without the H. Last spoke with Gabby on a FaceTime call about this time. So it's actually not quite clear in this article whether it was the 23rd or 24th. He said that Gabby told them that she and Brian were leaving Utah and driving to Grand Teton National Park in Wyoming. Mr. Schmidt, that's Jim, said that Gabby texted her mother a few times after that. Now, we don't really know exactly what all of the texts were or what the responses were to them, and we'll probably find that out when the phone data review is provided. In the Casey Anthony case, you also had Casey saying that she's going on a trip and I'm over here and I'm over there and I'm moving. And when that happens, you anticipate not hearing from someone for a while, right? Now, contextually, they expected not to hear from Gabby for a while because they were traveling into the high mountains of the Tetons in Wyoming. So that's kind of another aspect. The geography could actually interfere with that kind of thing. And that also plays a role to some extent in the Summer Wells case, where there's lack of cell phone reception to some extent. It also plays a role to some extent in the Barry Morphew case, which plays out in the mountains and backwoods of Colorado in the Salida area. And going back to the New York Times and the timeline, quote, Gabby texted her mother a few times after that, and then the last post on her Instagram account was published on August 25th, end quote. Now, what is kind of regrettable is if she was updating her Instagram regularly, as I think she kind of should have been, if you're trying to set yourself up on social media, then it would be quite obvious if she was doing daily updates and she was missing for one day, or if she was doing more regular updates than they actually were doing, right? And so that was something that was also not going to stand out, the fact that she wasn't updating her Instagram, right? Unfortunately, we don't know exactly what was said in the text messages after August 24th. We do know that by the time the last message was sent, although probably not at the time, Nicole was no longer convinced they were authentic, and I think she's right. But at the time, she probably may have accepted them at face value. I think a critical question as far as this goes, what was Nicole's response to Gabby's last text? Did she respond to it? Did she follow up? How long did she take to follow up? Did she establish when and where Gabby would be when she'd be in touch again? Once again, Nicole may have inferred that Gabby would be in Brian's care, even if things weren't going so great. But I wonder if Gabby's mother would have expected Brian to call her if anything went wrong. And that brings us to the fifth and final point. What has Nicole said so far? So if we want to sort of really be kind of laser in and be quite harsh, if we want to be judgmental, if we want to blame someone, we want to specifically point our finger at someone and say, it's this person's fault. It took so long to report Gabby missing. Well, who do we point our finger at? According to the Daily Mail, quote, Gabby's mother, Nicole Schmidt, told the Daily Mail in an exclusive interview that on September 10th, she reached out to Brian and his mother, Roberta Laundrie, trying to reach her daughter after she had not heard from Gabby since August 25th. And so I think you can put the shoe on the other foot as well, as you can say, what about Brian? Why did Brian say nothing? Also, you can take it from the 27th, but you can also take it from the day he arrived home. Why didn't Brian say nothing? Why did his mother say nothing? His father say nothing? Why didn't his parents communicate with her parents? So according to her interview with the Daily Mail, Nicole said, quote, I texted Brian's mom, that's Roberta, that I was trying to get in touch with Gabby. I also texted Brian. I got no replies. I knew something was wrong. I felt something was off and I needed to get her reported missing immediately, end quote. And this is the part that gets quite sort of weird is, so now she's realized something's wrong. She tries to get the attention of the police, but the police actually blow her off. It's in a weird way an echo of the Moab incident where the cops aren't sure what to do. They actually make a mistake. So that is also part of this complicated process of delay. It's involving quite a few people with quite a few misconceptions, misperceptions, right? And so the article goes on to say She went to report Gabby missing later that day, but police initially blew her off. The next day, she was allowed to file a report with the Suffolk County Police Department. One also wonders what may have happened, how could things have changed if she was able to report things just a day earlier. The article goes on to say, Detective Tracy Barry of the Suffolk County Police Department has been our angel taking on this case. She was the only one who listened and cared enough to take this on, end quote. So I think that's also quite important. You have a female detective who actually takes responsibility from the investigative side. I do think it took a really long time for Nicole to contact either Brian or Roberta. She may have been waiting kind of in a fairly passive way for Gabby to, get a signal and reach out to her. But the other side is, it took 10 days since the last text, and one can essentially add another week if you take it from the moment Gabby was last seen by her mother. That's on August 24th. Some reports actually indicate the 25th as the last date mother and daughter had contact. So even on that issue, that critical issue, the last time mother and daughter spoke, there's a little bit of discrepancy. I think it's the 24th, but as I say, some reports indicate the 25th as the last date. In any event, during that exchange, it does appear that Gabby may have expressed reservations about Brian. And this is according to an article on the news station KSL TV. Quote, she seemed okay to me at the time, other than I don't know where the relationship was going with the boyfriend. And that is what Nicole passed on to the news station, meaning Gabby seemed okay to me at the time, other than that she didn't know where the relationship was going with Brian. She doesn't refer to him as the fiancé, but the boyfriend. Not even as Brian, but the boyfriend. And the fact that she would express reservations about the relationship, not even the engagement, that might be something that Brian was also aware of, probably painfully aware of. Remember, they're living cheek by jowl, and so probably they would be expressing their misgivings about one another at these close quarters kind of constantly. The other thing I think to address is that her biological father, Joe, his last FaceTime with Gabby was on August 21st.
We still don't know where she is. Pride isn't an issue right now. My only daughter's missing, and I'm going to do anything I can. The family, Gabby's mom, we're going to do anything we can to find her.
That was Joe Petito, Gabby's biological father, talking to WPTV News. One other thing I noticed in the recent footage of the press conference was that Tara was the only parent who didn't really say anything, but what she's supposed to say. She's there in a supporting role, and I think therein lies an important part of the answer, right? Because it's a mixed family on Gabby's side, there's a complex family dynamic, and I don't know how well the Schmidts got along with the Laundries or the Petitos who lived there almost 3 hours drive away on the opposite side of the Florida Panhandle, on the opposite side of the state. Not to say they didn't get along, except that perhaps there was a closer relationship implied because Gabby's father lived closer to the Laundries, fairly near to them. But he also was not quite as close, Gabby's father, or in as regular contact with Gabby as her mother was. These natural fault lines in the family dynamic was something Brian probably felt he could take advantage of. He could manipulate the weaknesses of roles to his own advantage. And hasn't he? So I'm not going to take it further than that. I will be doing probably a live stream tomorrow dealing with rumor control, some interesting facts, some of the interesting discussions around this case, and also about the True Crime Rocket Science position on where we as the True Crime Rocket Science community think Brian is hiding and what his strategy is. So look out for that on Thursday afternoon. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.